Welcome back to Pen to Pod. On this episode, I talk with freelance editor Melissa Durston. We had an amazing chat, and honestly, not even all of it is in here because we chatted for so long. I tried to just keep the most important parts. Melissa is a wealth of knowledge in story structure, pacing, active versus passive voice, what types of editing you should choose, and that's only a little bit of the topics that we cover in this episode. I feel like this episode is going to help any writer at any stage that they are in, and Melissa was truly just a joy to chat with and to listen to. I was vigorously taking notes on my computer as she was talking, and I now have a lot of sticky notes around my desk thanks to some of the advice that she gave in this episode. If you are not following Melissa yet on any socials, go ahead and follow her on Instagram and Threads at herbookologist. All of these resources and so many more that she talks about will be listed in today's show notes. Okay, I'm gonna stop chatting. Let's go to the interview.
I'm ready. I have all the beverages.
I love it.
So
I know, I'm upset. I have my water, and I almost texted my husband. I was like, can you bring me up another beverage? Because I feel like I need a fancy beverage when I'm on a call with people.
I feel like if I don't have my beverage graveyard, it's not me. Like there needs to be multiple beverages here. Maybe I want a sip of coffee. Maybe I want some water. Who knows?
That is how I feel. I need every single beverage at my disposal at all times, just in case. How's your day been?
It's been good. Typical ADHD fashion. The moment you have a meeting in the afternoon, nothing else exists. So I spent most of my morning just talking to clients on and off, hanging out with my dog, and now I'm here.
I totally get that. I actually was just recently diagnosed with ADHD, and I was like, wow, my life makes sense. I didn't realize that not everyone waited until their next event, because that's also all that I do. So I totally understand that.
It's one of those things where you can't help it. Like even the beverage graveyard, it's 1,000% very common in neurodivergent offices or rooms. Like you will find a neurodivergent person and they will have 5 beverages with them. That's how you can spot us in the wild.
You said on your website that you edit fantasy, paranormal, kind of mystery, more of that genre fiction. So do you have like a favorite genre really in reading? Would it be fantasy?
And I don't know if I have a favorite. I like it all. When I was growing up, I was really into nonfiction. I was writing creative nonfiction, poetry. I was reading memoirs and just anything I could get my hands on. And then I don't know what happened. There was just a year where that switched. And all of a sudden, I was just obsessed with fantasy. And then explored horror some more, which was something I had read before anyway. Thriller, paranormal, anything witchy, anything cozy, anything where there's magic involved, I'm probably reading it. Anything if it feels like a Hallmark movie or coffee or just like that moment where you're all curled up and in a book, like a hug in a book, I'm there. So, I mean, I can't explain how it happened, but it happened. And by default, I like to edit the same thing. So it worked out.
I love that dramatic switch from like nonfiction
Explain
into You're like, actually, I'm done with the real world. Can I have magic?
I think there was just a point in adulthood where I was like, I'm done with this. Let me escape for a little bit. And then I was like, oh, wait a second. This is actually really nice.
Well, now that, we've talked a little bit about your reading taste, I'd love to take us back at least to some sort of beginning, because I'd love to know just when you first knew that you wanted to work with books or be a storyteller in general.
I don't know that I ever knew working with books was a real thing. It sounded like a fairy tale as a child. I grew up in a very small town in Ontario, Canada. There was next to nothing to really do. So a lot of what I did was write and read and like hole up in my bedroom. I never really saw storytelling as a thing until I was well into adulthood, and by then I'd written several books, but just at random. I think storytelling was always there. And then I did the logical thing and took a career in law, and then realized that wasn't what I was passionate about, because law is, it's lovely. There's a lot of writing and a lot of reading involved there too, but it's dry. It's not as fun. There was just like a crisis of like an identity crisis during my career where I was like, I don't know what to do. I don't know if this is right for me. I think there was a diagram online even where I was like, tell me what to do. Just tell me what I'm supposed to be doing with my life. And it said, you love books. Why aren't you working with books? And it's like, that's a good point. I do love books. Why aren't I? Penguin Random House happened to be hiring at the time. And I was like, let's try it. I got in. It took like 6 months, but I did it. And I think it was then that I was like, oh, wait a second. This is an actual thing that you can do with your life. And it blew my mind because it literally wasn't until adulthood that I ever took writing or reading as a career seriously. But I think like the explosion of the internet really helped people with that, because it used to be such a closed door thing where unless you had certain qualifications, you couldn't get into the doors of traditional publishing unless you took a certain route. And my route kind of looked like that. It was all over the place. But I mean, storytelling was there from the start. I think it just didn't click for me until adulthood that I could make a career out of it.
Yeah, and so you worked at Penguin Random House. I know you worked in the book industry for quite some time in marketing. How was that job, and how do you think it prepared you for where you are today?
It's it's a dream for anybody. I will tell you that. The moment you're walking in the walls of like a publisher where you've seen the penguin on the spine of all of your books for so long, it's just, it's surreal. At the same time, it's also just eye-opening because as a writer, you're like, what happens behind the scenes, and you learn what happens behind the scenes, and it's just eye-opening on such a different level. Marketing especially, I can't read without now seeing the marketing side of it, or seeing the specifics, or is this a high concept idea? How did it get from page to shelf? All of these things. So on some level, I'm super, super grateful for the experience and the people that I met. But at the same time, I was kind of enjoying the ignorance is bliss side of things. You get into you get into the industry, and there's just, you realize just how many hoops authors have to jump through. And I think that really propelled me to where I am now, realizing just how limited marginalized authors are to access to industry, to the same network of people that they can talk to. It made me very sad to see that traditional publishing wasn't as advanced, it wasn't as progressive as I anticipated it to be. And I kind of wanted to help bridge that gap. So I ultimately, that's why I left. But the experience, I wouldn't trade anything for it. Like it was wonderful, and I'm so grateful to have done it.
Making the jump from marketing into doing something for yourself because you weren't seeing kind of what you wanted out of this career, and you wanted to help others in a bigger way. What were the qualifications or credentials that you kind of needed to get to be an editor? Did you come in with it just with your background? Were there certifications you had to get?
It's a little bit of all of those things. It really depends on you as the editor, your journey to how you got there. While I was working for Penguin Random House, I was also studying. So I studied creative writing and then book publishing as well on top of that, which helped me a great deal because it involved a lot of editing classes and editing courses to teach me about the different styles. But working in law actually helped me more than my position in the industry itself, in understanding punctuation and how it could literally make or break something. It's so important in law that there's such a great emphasis on everything has to be in the right place. But when it comes to qualifications and credentials, it's going to differ from person to person. You can get the education, but experience is invaluable. Understanding the industry is invaluable. You can do this on your own. There are websites like Fiverr and Upwork that you can utilize just to build a portfolio, so to speak, and work that way with authors. Education helps, But at the end of the day, it's really exposure that's going to be your greatest tool.
No, that's great advice. I know I have a lot of people who asked that question. I posted on my Instagram. I was like, hey, who has questions for an editor? Just
People ask
because
that
I
a
was like,
lot. They're like, this must be
yeah.
some gate kept thing. How do people get into this elusive career? And it's we fumbled our way in, first of all. Like when I tell people my career trajectory, it's just ridiculous. Like I was working in freelance and then it was management and then it was law and then it was working in publishing, studying publishing and then I just one day, Rebecca Thorne, the author of Can't Spell Treason Without T, we had this random conversation where she was like, I don't understand why you aren't your own boss yet. And I was like, okay. And then I started my own business based off that. Like it really depends on who you are and what you want to do. There are different styles of editing too. So which one you want to specialize in, I would focus all your attention to that. Interested in the developmental side of things, beta read for people, join Facebook groups even where you can exchange services or critique partners. You can do that as well where you're just reading with a more analytical lens. That'll help you there. If you're more interested in the spelling and grammar or correctness side of things, then that's where I would say you probably want to take a few courses just to make sure you understand because grammar rules are very specific and very subjective at the same time. So understanding the balance between those is really integral for success in that vein. Again, it really depends. I feel like I'm going to say that a million times. We'll just get that out there. It depends on so much.
No, it really does. And I like hearing stories though about people's career paths that didn't take such a linear path. It seems like you kind of did a little bit more of a zigzag, but everything has built upon each other, which is really cool to
Yes,
see because, if you went into law and it seems like you do have kind of this analytical, logical side. And that seems to really help though when starting your own business. Like you do
yes.
need that grounding of the logical analytical piece to be able to put all this together. And same with marketing. Like all of
Mhm.
these use kind of both sides of that creative and logical brain. So it's cool
It
to see
definitely
how
helps.
they're separate, but they all seem to kind of work together, which is really
They
cool.
really, really do. And I'm so grateful um, that I didn't take the traditional pathway. When I was having a conversation with, as part of the interview process for Penguin Random House, I had a conversation with the CEO and we were talking about the parallels between the legal industry and the publishing industry. And it was super fascinating just in general. But it was such a wonderful conversation because it reminded me that all skills are transferable. They compound each other, one thing onto the next, onto the next. And now I may have taken a million zigzags to get here, but all of this experience is relevant in its own way. Understand contracts better because I have my legal experience. I understand the intricacies of a business because I worked in law. And because I worked in the industry and the publishing industry, now I have such intimate knowledge of how a book actually comes to fruition and all the different pieces that need to be in perfectly right place in order for that to happen. And I can help self-publishing authors by sharing some of that knowledge with them. And I can help people who are headed on the traditional pathway to kind of help them with their materials or help them get a leg in. I've had so many calls with people who are just curious about how to get to that point of how do you get into this industry? How do you actually publish a book? All of these random things. And it's crazy to think that my weird trajectory now gives me this wealth of knowledge that I can share with them.
You talked about that with traditional publishing, how it is a corporation and a business at the end of the day. So there are a lot of hoops authors have to jump through.
So
Like you
many.
said, it's not always, yeah, it's not always as inclusive, and a lot of information feels gate kept or
Mm-hmm.
confusing. So you being able to help out authors, in this position, how has that been? And, now being that wealth of knowledge, like you said, for people and just being able to help authors in a secondary way.
I love it so much. I have zero walls up when it comes to this kind of thing because there is nothing I would have loved more than to have had somebody have these conversations with early in my career to see this as a feasible thing that I could actually do and be successful in. And had I known that, I probably would have pursued it much sooner in life. But when I was growing up, a lot of this stuff was kept behind lock and key. No one was really sharing this information, no one was talking about it. And what the internet has done for us and the exposure of things like book talk and these conversations where you can be talking to a New York Times bestselling author and they're sharing feedback on the other side. This new level of transparency we've brought to the conversation has just been so wonderful. And if there's anything I can do for the authors that I work with, or just authors in general, to help them take that next step, it doesn't matter which pathway they're headed on, even if I can help, like, just shed some light on it in any possible way I can. I'd much rather help and answer those questions than have somebody just feeling the same freeze that I felt of, I know I went in the wrong direction because I didn't know it was plausible. I didn't know you could actually work with books for a living. I thought that was like a unicorn of a thing. But now, looking back, if I had just had somebody to talk to, then I probably would have got there a lot sooner. So if there's people who have those questions, I'd rather just be a resource than anything else, even if they're not an active client of mine. Even if they message me, I'd rather help than not. So it's been a wonderful experience for me to be able to do that for people, the very thing that I was looking for. Um, and it's just liberating in all sorts of ways.
Yeah, no, that's really beautiful. And I think it's been really encouraging to see this growth in self-publishing over the
Mm,
last 5 to 8 years, and people kind of taking that back for themselves as well
yeah,
and being able to, take the process back in their hands and use the community for information. It is beautiful to see all the people who kind of lift each other up and aren't afraid to share advice or tidbits and
yeah.
everything. And,
It's
our
not gate
editors
kept
are important.
anymore.
Right, right.
It's not being held behind anything. Everyone would rather talk to each other or help each other. I'm a part of so many discords where it's just authors helping authors, writers helping writers, editors helping people, and it's literally just conversations. You're stuck on this thing, I have the answer for you. And it's really lovely to see because it's never been like that before. And we really do have self published authors to thank for this revolution
Yeah.
of information.
Yeah, I completely agree. And with this advice, do you have any advice for aspiring freelance authors, or not freelance authors, freelance editors, aspiring freelance editors?
This advice goes for both. I say network. It sounds like I'm an 80-year-old man saying this, but I honestly stand by it. It sounds like something someone older, much older would say, but I mean it. Networking has been revolutionary in my career in meeting just random people, absolutely random, and the things that it has done for my knowledge of the industry, my ability to be successful, but it's also made connections for me with other people, but also networking in the sense of don't be afraid to reach out. Connect with people as much as you can, join as many communities as you can, because these people have so much information to share. Authors on threads are always posting saying, just ask me, and I stand by this so much. It's better to ask. Worst case scenario, they maybe don't have time to respond, but best case scenario, you're going to have the conversation of a lifetime and learn so much. So if I have anything for both aspiring authors and editors, it's really to network and get to know your community and just connect with other people who are doing the exact same thing as you.
I love that you're a part of so many discords, it seems like too, like a lot of online
So
communities. So with the Discord where you're a standby editor, and you're there to help, do you get a lot of questions from people of what does an editor do?
Yeah, these are frequent questions. We even started in, like, I wrote up an FAQ, most frequently asked questions. Number one question is, what do editors do? And the second question is, what types of editing are there? Because for some people, they hear editing and they think it's all just one thing. And for other people, they're like, I know there's a million pieces here, but I couldn't tell you what is what.
Yeah.
But I feel like those are the two most common ones.
Yeah. And so for anyone listening who might have those questions, are you able to break down the different types of editing for the listeners?
Yes. First of all, what does an editor do? We take manuscripts. We basically take the foundation of your story and your voice as an author. We just kind of help soften it up. We're making some changes, some suggested changes. We're making it feel the right pace. We're making it feel structured. We're making sure your characters make sense. But we're really just a partner in the background. It's the author's voice we're trying to protect most of all. I feel like that was a long-winded answer to say we read your book and we tell you what we can do better. But for the different types of editing, there's so many. I find this question kind of hard to answer because there are some terms that we use interchangeably depending on where you are in the industry. Some terms that are separate for different areas of the industry. Because I'm from a traditional publishing background, for me, there's four. For everybody else, there might be two or three. So for developmental editing, also known as substantive editing or content editing, this is like an autopsy at like the story level of characters, plot, structure, world building, magic systems, your characters' arcs, their growth. We're looking at pacing, we're looking at believability, we're making sure everything makes sense at the end of the day. We're leaving comments in the document. We're sending a 15 to 50 page document with all the information about your book. We also do, some editors like me do book mapping, which is something else that's super helpful. For line editing, it's kind of like what it sounds like. It's a line level edit. It's at the sentence. It's more stylistic than anything else, but we're looking for clarity, cohesion, everything flows, it makes sense. If you're using a word that sounds absolutely bonkers, we're checking to make sure it's a real word. We're making sure your language, if it's a fantasy, is consistent throughout. For copy editing, and this is where it gets a little kind of mushy, is that some people use line editing and copy editing interchangeably to say the same thing to mean line editing. But for me, copy editing is the step you take before you format your novel. So this is especially important for self-published authors. This is the step that traditional publishers take. And what it is that's your spelling, that's your grammar, punctuation. But what a lot of people don't know is that the copy editor is basically your superhero. They're the ones who are going to spot that you have blue eyes on page 50 and green eyes on page 100. They're the ones who are checking to make sure that the rules of your magic system are actually being abided by, and you didn't just make something up at the end that absolutely makes no sense for the rest of it. But it's that level of consistency. Or if you're really terrible at figuring out whether it's effect or effects with an A or with an E, they're also checking for that. There, and there, we're checking for that. And then last is proofreading. This is a step that isn't always needed. It takes place after you've formatted your novel. The reason that there are two kind of bookending the formatting process is because once you format the book, making anything significant change-wise can really disrupt how it looks on the page. And because everything has to fit a certain way, it's recommended to make sure you do all the editing before, and then you maybe do a final pass at the end. But I also make sure, to the best of my abilities, that I explain these things on my website so that when people are coming to look to work with me, they can be like, so this is the difference between this, this, and this.
Yeah. And I will say, having looked at your website, it is very well done. You definitely give a lot of detail to what you do. So I
I
agree
hope
with that.
so. It took me so long to make. It was quite a process to build that thing.
Yeah. So if you are someone who is wanting to go on the self-publishing journey, would you recommend them have all of these layers of editing, just one or two?
Mm,
How would you have them approach the editing process?
It depends. It depends. I think for self-publishing, it really matters on how much faith the author has in which level of their editing. If you are someone who naturally planner, so your structure is on point, you know your pacing is good, you know that you have solid characters and their arcs make sense, then you don't really need a developmental edit. You can fully rely on your alpha readers, beta readers, and critique partners to get any additional feedback that you need. If you're someone who writes really neatly, you probably don't need a line edit. If you have a good grasp of grammar, you probably don't need a copy edit. But it really depends on what kind of writer you are, if you're an underwriter, an overwriter, what your strengths are, where your opportunities lie. I would say that if I was going to recommend any one service for a self-published author, it would probably be a copy edit, just because there's so much captured in that. And then you're not relying on something like, I know Pro Writerly Aid, it's very commonly used amongst self-published authors. And then you don't have to rely on a machine, and you can have a human-led editing experience for your book, which I think is really important because a lot of it is subjective and some of these programs can't capture that.
Yeah. I really like that. That's interesting that you said, if you feel like you have a good grasp of structure, arc, rely on your beta readers. Because I feel like I've heard the opposite of everyone kind of leaning into developmental editing. But that makes sense of what you said, that a lot of things that can fall by the wayside are more of the grammar, the
It's
sentence
really more
structure.
at the line level, or because your readers are so smart. Like this is literally who you're writing the book for. Yes, a developmental edit will blow your mind, the things that we cover in it, the things that we find. But I feel like if you're a pantser, please get a developmental edit. I know this from experience. My stories never make sense at the end. They're well written, but my structure's a mess. But for the planners out there, I have one client who just has like this sheet where she outlines absolutely everything. And by the time I got finished her developmental edit, I had next to no notes on structure. There were some notes on pacing, obviously, but for the most part, she had a really good grasp at a developmental level of what needed to be done. And I think that if you plan it well enough before you write it, you probably don't need to lean on a developmental as much.
So for self-publishing, it kind of, like you said, it depends on the
It
writer's
really does.
strength
Yeah.
and, what they're looking for out of their manuscript. But for someone going into traditional publishing, would you recommend that they go to an editor before querying, or how would you kind of approach that?
I feel like if you're pursuing traditional publishing has so many phases of editing. This is one of the things that I learned as a writer going to work for a traditional publisher, that, oh my God, there are so many steps after the fact. You query, yes, and then you get your agent. There's going to be an edit with your agent. There could be one draft, there could be two drafts, there could be multiple after that. It depends on where your book is at. After that, you go on submission. There might be editors as part of the submission process who suggest a revise and resubmit. That's a consideration. And then after that, once your book sells, you're going to go through 7 more drafts probably with your editor. And even after that, you still have to go through copy editing, line editing if they want it, proofreading. There's so many drafts that your book will go through that I don't see the value in investing in a freelance editor beforehand unless you feel like you need it. If you feel strongly that your book would benefit from something like a developmental edit or a line edit, those are probably the only two I would probably recommend. I wouldn't bother too much with grammar. That's not really what they're looking at. And for the most part, it'll get fixed a million times, and the actual structure of the book will change so many times that it doesn't really matter. If you're looking at two services to get, you would probably be looking at developmental or line editing. If there was one service that, if you're unsure, I get a lot of people who get manuscript evaluations instead. It's a much cheaper alternative to a developmental edit. It goes in the same amount of detail without the same number of pages. There's no book mapping, at least for me as an editor. Um, and it's less feedback, but it's a more detailed beta reader. Just like with self-publishing, if you have a good support group of critique partners and beta readers, you can probably rely on them for feedback. I feel like I'm telling people just don't go to an editor, but I promise there are times when you need to. I promise there are times. It's such an investment that it needs to be the best thing for both you and your story. If your story doesn't need it, if you need it, if you want that extra layer of support, we're here for you. But it really depends at the end of the day on how confident you are in your story and how you wrote it and your characters and if everything makes sense.
I think that is great advice because, like you said, it is an investment that is important, but it does take quite a bit of capital for someone to put up
Yes.
on their own to invest in that service. So it's good to know for, aspiring authors, no matter what route, which ones they should really look for. But it seems like it comes down to kind of knowing who you are, knowing your
Yes.
story, what it needs. And seems like it really comes down to finding the right editor, finding an editor who
Yes.
will talk through this with you, help you figure out the best route, someone who has everything listed well on their website and like you do, and making sure they fully understand the services.
Shameless
Because I'm
plug.
sure, yes, shameless plug, but I'm sure there are many nuances between, like you
So
said
many.
before, every editor is also very different in what they offer. And
Yes.
even now there's editors and there are book coaches. So there's like a whole array of people
There's
that you could
There are so
hire.
many things you can
I
do.
know.
I do know some, like Isabel Sterling, she wrote These Witches Don't Burn. It's a YA witchy
Mhm.
novel. She does book coaching. I had a session with her ages ago. She's super lovely. And if there was anyone I wanted to coach me, it would be someone like her. But I've met so many book coaches get into book coaching, not realizing just how much of an effect they can have on
Mhm.
people, and just it's so important that you find the right people, that you find the right coach, you find the right editor, you find the right people to work with your story. I've heard so many horror stories working in the freelance industry of people who connected with the wrong person and they left that experience with no confidence in themselves or their work, which is
Mhm.
why it's so, so important that you do your due diligence, you do your research, and you make sure that the person that you want to work with, whether it's a coach or whether it's an editor, or even if it's a book cover designer, literally anyone you are paying for their expertise, make sure one, they have the expertise, two, um, you vibe with their feedback style because some people are very blunt, some people are a lot less blunt, and some people are a good amount of the middle. I consider myself solution oriented, so when I'm giving feedback, I'm always giving solutions to the problem instead of just pointing out the problem.
That's a really good point too with feedback. And I know I had a question in here for you about your feedback style. So it seems like you said it's more solution oriented. So how do you go about delivering some of those kind of tougher news where it's like, okay, this is going to be a big change and a big edit?
I spilled my coffee, but
No,
we're fine.
not one of our needed drinks.
I'm so sorry. I had a feeling I would do this. I was like, you really shouldn't have beverages while you have this conversation. There's nothing important on the desk right now because I am prone to spilling. In terms of feedback style, I definitely do the solution-oriented approach, and it's because that's how I benefit from feedback. So if someone is letting me know, hey, this isn't working, I like to brainstorm on the spot of being like, okay, this didn't work, but why? And so when I'm thinking of the authors that I'm working with, I want them to be able to have the answer to that why question, to be like, I'm not saying this just to say it. I'm saying it because A, B, or C reason. If something's not working, I want you to know why I felt that in the moment. Feedback also depends on which service you're looking for. So,
Mhm.
developmental, we're looking at in marginal comments, inline changes just briefly if there's anything we see throughout, as well as long, like an editorial letter that covers all of our bases to let you know everything we came across and all of your strengths and opportunities in the manuscript. For copy editing, obviously, we're letting you know, hey, you love commas a little bit too much, or those ellipses out of there. I love a good M dash, so I am guilty of it myself. But feedback is so important. Feedback style is so important. If you're somebody who is very sensitive, it's going to be so important for you to line up with an editor who can be aware of that and can work with you in a way that doesn't trigger you or upset you per se. Just they can be gentle in nature versus somebody who's sensitive working with somebody who's very blunt and very straight and to the point. But this is why sample edits exist. So for anyone listening, always get a sample edit for this reason, because this is how we tell you how we communicate and what that would look like, whether it's a comment, an inline change, whether it's in the email, in the feedback. It's kind of just so important. I always call it a matchmaking affair because it kind of is. Like, it matters who you, this is your story. You've put so much blood, sweat, and tears into this thing. It's your whole personality for a very long time, and you're sharing a piece of yourself. So to make sure that you partner with somebody who understands you, the direction you want to take your story in. Are you spilling beverages too?
Now I just spilled a beverage. This is comical. I'm just gonna grab something for that.
This is so funny. I love this for us.
I mean, like, it's because we talked about it, right? It's because we talked about how many drinks we need that we're gonna just spill them all. Let us all protect our peace and our drinks. And okay, we're good now. Okay. So
I don't
feedback.
remember.
I know. I think we were talking about feedback and making sure that the sample edits are like a matchmaking affair.
Mm-hmm.
And then I spill my drink.
And you threw your drink across the desk.
Exactly.
It's so important. I think I have a post on Threads somewhere where it's just like red flags when hiring an editor. And it's because one of my biggest pieces of feedback in that, I think I even have a video lingering somewhere about it, is that you should never work with an editor who isn't willing to offer that, because it is so important. I've had authors talk to authors who, and this happens in the traditional publishing sphere as well, where these matchups don't really work out. Agents and authors as well. So it's not just in self-publishing and in freelancing. This exists as a problem in the industry as a whole. In some areas, you get a choice. So if you do have the ability to protect yourself and your piece, you should, which is why sample edits are so integral. It's also important to us as the editor because it gives us a sense of your writing style. If we think we're the best person for your book, depending on what the content is. If there's a dog dying in your manuscript, I am not for you. I will cry. I will cry for days. I'll never recover. But it matters for both parties. So it's for the author, it's for the editor, but it's mostly just to protect everybody involved and make sure that you're in the right pairing and you're not with somebody who you don't feel comfortable with, or who makes you feel afraid or makes you feel like your book isn't going to, like your book is garbage. You want somebody who can champion you, who can be honest with you, who can give you constructive feedback that you feel like you can successfully implement. And I mean, I could go on and on about this. I think it's so important. Whether the sample is paid or free, just make sure you get one.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense because, like you said, writing is so vulnerable. I actually just finished editing a video of me reading my old writing and exposing myself, and it's horrible. And it just reminded me how vulnerable it is to share your writing with someone. And yeah, making sure that pairing is good is, like you said, good for both. Good for both because you have an editor who believes in your work and is excited to read it. And then also you have someone who can encourage you more than discourage you, even when giving constructive feedback, which is really important.
It's knowing yourself too, right? Knowing how you accept feedback. If you're somebody who benefits from the compliment sandwich, I do. Like, that's so important to know. If you're somebody who likes, like, I have some clients who are just like, be honest with me. Like, if this is garbage, you need to tell me it's garbage and I will deal with that, but I need you to tell me. And I have other clients where it's more of a softer process where it's like, hey, this was great, but I would love to see us work on this, this, and this. But it really depends on the person, and how they receive feedback personally. But yeah, also what they want in an editor.
And when you're taking on a new client, so they come to you, you guys agree that you guys are good, they get that sample edit done. Do you talk about feedback with them in like that first initial call? Like, what is that process like for when you take on a client?
It differs for every client. It really depends on where they found me, how the sample edit went. But before we even go ahead with the sample edit, I talk to them about the sample edit and let them know, like, hey, this is our opportunity to make sure we're a match. This is to make sure that my feedback style suits your needs and vice versa, and that this is going to work out. And then when I reconnect after they've let me know that they've read it, I get feedback on, I think this is right for me, I don't think this is right for me. And then we go from there and we kind of just say, let's do this thing, let's work together. I do think it's a great match. If we are, then it's more logistics after that. But usually within the sample process, you can kind of get an immediate sense of how it's going to go throughout the process. Just in general, talking to another person, you can kind of get that feeling of, I think this is going to work, or I don't think this is going to work. But it's very rare that I've turned somebody away because I don't think it's going to work out. It's usually the other way around. Maybe somebody will work better with a different editor versus me, and all the more power to them. I literally send them emails saying, I love that you did this. I'm so glad that you didn't just say yes to me to say yes to me. I'd love to work together, but I'm also biased. um, I mostly care about the author. I care that they don't sign with me just because they want to. They sign with me because they actually think that this is a good matchup and that we will do well together. And the people I have worked with, it makes the feedback extra special when they come to me to say, I'm so glad we connected, or I'm so glad so and so introduced us, than having worked with somebody who was unsure, or maybe my feedback style didn't suit what they needed, or maybe my vision for the book didn't suit their vision. I hate the idea of somebody just leaping in full force and it not being right for them.
Yeah, and so when you're taking on this client, you're realizing, okay, this is a good match for both of us. I like what you're writing. You like my vibe and my editing style. How long does it typically take for an edit? And does that timeline really look like?
It depends on the service. So for a developmental edit, it takes 4 to 6 weeks for me. And it's because I do 2 passes of the manuscript. I'm doing book mapping at the same time. If I have a 135,000 word manuscript, it's going to take me a lot longer than if I have a 60,000 word manuscript. But that's why I always give a time range. But it also depends. Like a copy edit would only take a couple weeks. A line edit would take a couple weeks, but maybe one or two more than a copy edit would. And the developmental edit is what takes the longest for me, just because I offer so much as part of that process. So from start to finish, we say yes. I almost said we say yes to the dress. We say yes to the partnership. We decide to go ahead, and then it's all the logistics after that. We choose a start date. I send them a query form so that they can give me more information about their story. They can ask questions. They can upload their manuscript. They can give me their synopsis so I can even read that for them if that's what they're interested in. If they're interested in traditional publishing, I always recommend they share their query with me, and then I can give them feedback on that. But then from there, it takes a long time. I wish I was someone who could do it in 4 days, but no, it takes about 6 weeks because of how much energy is invested. When you do a first pass, you're mostly just taking notes and leaving marginal comments the whole time. The second pass, you're a little more honed in and focused on making sure everything makes sense and trying to capture the little things. And then after that, it's filling out the book map, which outlines all the arcs, all the chapters, word counts, which is a really beneficial thing to use even if you're not working with an editor. If you've ever seen those images passed around where the chapters are on the left and you have all the arcs up top, I think Dabble Writer, the program, does this just naturally.
Mm-hmm.
It's so beneficial to have because you can see the lulls in your arcs and you can see lulls in timing and you can see when your pacing is off. And then after that, it's a phone call. So I send the feedback off to the clients. I give them some time to review it, and then we have a conversation. And it's literally just whatever you want to talk about. If you want to talk about the book, if you want to talk about the feedback, if you want to pick my brain about marketing, I'm here for you. I will literally talk about whatever because I love to talk about all the things. But I think that's my favorite part, is just having that conversation. And I think it's special for authors because how often do you have someone who can talk that intimately about your book the same way?
Yeah. Yeah. And so I love the book mapping concept because someone who's obsessed with structure as well, and
I've
someone
seen your
who,
YouTube. I've seen.
yeah, someone who loves structure, someone who's a visual person in general. Is there a specific type of plot structure that you like adhere to and use for the book map, or is it just
This is a question I typically ask clients because chances are they have one that they use or that they
dependent?
refer to. And so if they have a specific one that was what was used for the book, that's the one I'm probably going to provide feedback on just to make sure it's hitting the beats. For any of the romances I do, I'm a big fan of romancing the beats, which is a great resource. But for the most part, I'm I'm kind of just using either the 3 act structure or the 6 act structure to kind of see where it fits in because I think when you choose other structures, it just gets too complicated, and you want the author to be able to understand the feedback that you're providing them, and the easiest way to explain that is with the most well-known structures as opposed to Save the Cat, which someone might not inherently know. That's the one I actually know the best,
Mm-hmm.
but it might not be what works for their story because every story is going to be different. It also depends on what genre they're operating in, on what subplots they have, how complex the storyline is, whether it's a series or a standalone. Because if it's a series, you have the overarching series plot and then you have the individual book plot. So it ends up depending on the author, what they maybe use, and then from there, I kind of just use my best judgment.
I personally love the zigzag story structure. That's probably my
I've
favorite.
seen.
It
It's
just it
my
works.
favorite.
Yeah, and I think that is true. And I've said this on my channel as well that like all outlines are the same. They're saying the same things, but you
They're
have to like
saying the same thing, just in weird language.
right. You
It's
just have to
it's
figure
the
out which one makes
same
sense.
it's the same story in different languages.
Hmm.
We're hitting the same beats. It's just they might have a different term for it. But the main things that you want to hit are going to be universal throughout. So those are the ones I kind of lean on the most. Like, is your inciting incident happening too soon or too late in the story? How
Hmm.
far are we in the book when we hit your midpoint? Where are we at when the bad guys close in? Those sorts of things. But if someone came to me and they were like, "I live and breathe Save the Cat," I'd be like, "I got you. You're covered. We're fine."
I love it. And so for people who maybe are still writing or they struggle with structure or knowing even honestly where to start with that, do you have any advice of how to think about structuring your book?
If someone's a brand new writer and they're new to writing, I think it's so important to understand the foundation of the craft. This is where these books come in handy, like Save the Cat, the 5 sentence method, 6 act story structure, 3 act story structure, hero's journey. Getting to know them is your best friend in this process because the more you work with them, the more you can slowly start to understand as you're writing Or even as you're watching a movie, I'll be sitting there going, this is the status quo moment, or bad guys are closing in now, or this is gather the team. That's like it becomes muscle memory for you as an author eventually. So if you are a new writer, that is your best friend. If you're a writer who has been writing for a long time and you're struggling with structure, I say it's the same advice, like go back to basics, go back to your craft books, just refamiliarize yourself with why we're hitting those beats, and also reading. Reading is so integral. I know it's said a lot, like read a lot, write a lot, but it's important for a lot of reasons. I even would go as far as to say if you can read a physical hard copy book more often, do it, because there's a reason why, um, like, there's a reason why these pages matter. Like just looking at a page, you can tell how fast the pacing is going just based on how big the chunks of text are, how little they are. Is there a lot of dialogue? Is there a little dialogue? Is there a lot of exposition? And going back to basics is what's going to remind you of that, and reading is going to remind you of that. And then eventually it just kind of becomes muscle memory, which will help you in the long run. And then if you hit a point where you're like, I just can't, you're looking at your manuscript and you want to claw your eyes out, that's when you probably should talk to an editor and we can help you.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful, and I completely agree. I feel like reading is your best free resource that you can
It
get.
really is.
That you can just, well, not books aren't all free, but from the library they are. And
Libby,
you,
everybody.
right, and you can study them and, figure that out for yourself. But kind of the sister to structure is pacing, which you've
Mm-hmm.
mentioned quite a bit. And I personally feel like pacing is easy for me to tell when I'm reading a book because I'm like, okay, come on,
I'm
let's get a
bored. Can
move
we get
on.
on with it? Yeah.
But I feel like I personally have a hard time as a writer sometimes identifying my own pacing issues because I'm so bogged down in like making sure I get every event I want on the page. So for someone who might feel similarly, like what is your advice for someone who is kind of having a hard time with pacing?
I think you're right that it's really hard to be objective as a writer. You can read somebody else's book and be like, this is the exact precise moment where I lost absolute interest because it just took too long to get to the point. But as writers, we're like, it's amazing. Um, this is perfect. But I think we have to part of part of understanding pacing is going back to the psychology of it and just the intricacies of how the reader actually reads a text. So when a reader is reading, their eyes are going left to right. It's natural, scientifically natural for the eyes to move more quickly over shorter bursts of text than it is longer bursts of text, things like that. But also, this is kind of where book mapping comes in. Even any outlining that you can possibly do, even if it's a spreadsheet where you just write all the word counts, because you can see just glancing at numbers, and I think numbers are really important for me, even as an editor. Just seeing that visual is so important because you can be like, I see for 50 pages, I haven't mentioned the most important subplot. It's been 10,000 words and I haven't hit the inciting incident. Things like that. So I feel like my advice when it comes to pacing and understanding how pacing works in your own novels as writers um, is to just lean on the tools available to you, like plotting spreadsheets, book mapping spreadsheets. I'm just gonna say all the spreadsheets. They're they're such an incredible tool. It's what I use to understand pacing as an editor. It's what I use to understand pacing as a writer. But we can also go back to reading physical books because there's reading a book as a reader and there's reading a book as a writer. And when you're reading a book as a writer, those are the moments where you can mark a text and be like, I like what they did here. And you can likely identify why you like it. If you're reading a book and you're like, the pacing feels so quick, look to see why you feel that way. because then you can identify that in your own books. But let's say you finished your whole novel, it's all done. All of your beta readers have come to you and been like, I don't know, man, it lulled around like chapter 10. That's where I would be like, bring out a spreadsheet, write down all the scene numbers, write down all the word counts, write down when all the beats are hitting, and bring it back to the numbers, because it's just easier as a visual to understand pacing when you can look at it. Because then you can be like, oh, it goes like this, or it's just a flat line. It's never actually just a flat line. But um, pacing is one of the hard ones. I think it's one of my favorite things to provide feedback on because I get to make a fancy graph. But it's one of the things that as writers, it's too difficult for us to be objective enough to understand that. But if you're writing an action scene, make your sentences shorter. Your world building, it'll probably be bigger, like bigger expositional paragraphs. But things like that, just being conscious of those tiny things are what make up pacing, really.
I love spreadsheets personally. I'm a huge fan of
I'm a
spreadsheets.
huge
So
fan, and I feel like I just nerded out over spreadsheets, and I can't stop talking about them. I love them so much. They're so helpful.
yeah, and that's a good point. I never thought about looking at it actually like word count based, pacing wise. That makes a lot of sense of like breaking it up that way and seeing it in that form.
Well, we focus so much on word count as a whole that we forget that word count applies to every scene we're writing. If you have one scene that's 700 words, it's going to feel tremendously faster than a scene that's 5,000 words. Like, it's so important to understand that, because you can look at your manuscript for as long as you want, and it's never going to make sense until you can really put a visual to it. It's just so beneficial for you to see it in front of you in a way that isn't in 12 point Times New Roman font in a Word document. It ends up being better to be like, oh, I see. Like, if you have consistently 6 chapters that are all hitting like between 4 to 5,000 words, that's like, there's a lull there. But it also helps if you're tracking other things at the same time for the same reason, because you can
Mm-hmm.
identify so much by just putting a visual to it.
Yeah, same. I'm a very visual learner.
It's the neurodivergent brain. Like, I love a good visual. I love to be able to see it. Even in my feedback to clients, I add different charts and graphs and different little things so I can be like, here's what it looks like, and then here's how to fix it, obviously, but this is what it looks like. And it's just easier to explain when you have hard, concrete proof, and you can be like, just look at this, versus you see right here on this page, it just feels like it lulls. Like, it doesn't hit the same way.
Yeah, and alongside pacing, I think another thing that I struggle with sometimes, with pacing at least, is subplots, which you've mentioned, and you offer in some of your services of helping to kind of wrangle the crazy subplots in. I'd love to know from your perspective, how many subplots do you think is too many?
There's definitely an answer to that. Um, there's, I'd say the average is probably 2 or 3. And then depending on which genre you are in, it should either be less or more. If you're writing like a high fantasy trilogy, there's obviously going to be a lot going on. But I'd say try and to the keep it to the average as much as possible. Try not to go too crazy, because the more subplots you add, the harder it becomes for the reader to understand what the heck is going on. But also because it's really hard to tie those all back in. Subplots exist to help the reader understand the main plot better,
Hmm.
especially if we're talking about a fantasy, a Hobbit, for example. Like, the main plot is Bilbo Baggins going on an adventure, but some of the subplots, like you have the ring, you have Thorin's obsession with the Arkenstone, those all come back in the end to matter to the main plot. They become part of the climax, they become part of the end, they become part of the political intrigue. Like, they're so important to the finalization of the manuscript as a whole. if you get too carried away with subplots, it becomes difficult to do that nicely. And it
Hmm.
becomes messy. And this is how plot holes tend to happen, is because we let subplots get too carried away, or we have too many things going on. But we also want to consider why these subplots are relevant. How do they relate to your character? And are they actually serving the main plot, or is it just something nice to have? Because if it's not doing anything for the book or the characters, it doesn't need to be
Yeah. I feel like I needed to hear that today. That hard truth.
there. Is this secretly
Well,
because you have like 12
calling
subplots
me
going
out.
on?
I mean, not that many, but I've always struggled with subplots. I also wrote it, like, I did a video on this of like the fun and games section in
See, the
general
fun
has
and
always
games
been
section is like my Achilles heel.
same.
I
It's
can
it's
see
just so
it
weird.
play like a movie in my head. I understand,
Hmm.
like, if I'm reading someone else's book, I can be like, I'm in the fun and games section. I see this so clearly. But in my book, I'm
Yep.
like, I'm going to skip Act Two and just finish Act Three instead. And I have a lot of books where there is no Act Two. I'm
Yeah.
avoiding fun and games.
Yeah, I feel that. I love it in movies and I can easily spot it and I know what should be in there at a very fundamental level. But when I have to do it, there's no fun and there's no games and I don't like it at all. And just avoid it. So
It's it doesn't happen quite like the movie montage, and I think
it
that's what
does
makes me
not.
sad, is why isn't it a
True.
cute montage, you know? But I think like there is such a thing as too many subplots, but I think so long as your subplots have like a solid significance to the book, then it's gonna fit in there. But I think it's also important that you're making sure, because I think of like the main plot as like the house and the structure as the foundation, and your subplots are the pillars holding up the house. If any single one of those don't go from point A to point B, and you don't let them have a proper growth arc, and you aren't foreshadowing them properly, then it really just, going back to pacing, it really just lulls, and it just adds unnecessary information that the reader doesn't need, and they end up feeling so unfulfilled and unsatisfied in the end, because
Mm.
they're like, well, what happened to ABC thing, or where did this person go? You had them on like chapter 3 and they just up and vanish. Subplots are hard. They really are. Making them come full circle in a way that is done successfully and nicely is also hard. But if you're having troubles with your subplots, your beta readers will help. They'll be able to be like, hey, I need you to get rid of this. It makes no sense. Or I don't know what happened here. We have a subplot starting here. It's in the end, but there's absolutely nothing in the middle. So I have zero context, or you're setting somebody up for something and then it falls off the page, and so there's no emotional impact for the reader. So I think subplots are tricky, and
Hmm.
getting them just right is tricky, but I believe in you.
Thank you. I
You're
needed to hear
welcome.
that. Speaking of tricky, I have a couple things that I wrote down that I feel
I'm
like
ready.
I've either heard from other people that are tricky or personally I find tricky.
Okay, hit
And
me.
mention also helping with active versus passive voice,
Everybody is a killing deal.
which I hate. Could you also explain maybe what? Because I think a lot of writers don't even know like what active voice versus passive voice is and
We
when
all
should we
do
use
it,
them?
first of all. Active voice is when the subject is doing the action, and passive voice is when the action is happening to them. So, like, I don't know, tag, like Tom tags Sarah is active. Sarah was tagged by Tom is
Mm.
passive. Like, we took too many words to get to the same point, and it's slower. It pulls the reader out of the narrative, and there's just such a cleaner way to say it that puts the action first, and that's what makes writing so engaging. The trick to passive voice is, if you find yourself using any of the to be verbs,
Mm.
is, are, was, been, were, you're using passive voice in those moments. But I got some really great advice at random from, I think I came across it in a random Reddit forum, but it was, bring the action to the character. I don't know how to explain this in a better way. He did a much better job of it. But it was instead of having action go to them, because the action ends up happening toward the end of the sentence, bring it to the front.
Mm.
So it's happening straight away. Poor Tom. Um, you know, if we're writing that in passive voice, we've completely left Tom out of it. Sarah
Mm.
was tagged, leaves Tom out of it. Sarah was tagged by Tom, just kind of, eh, like it doesn't do the same thing as Tom tags Sarah. And then you can, I mean, I didn't choose the most interesting sentence, but I mean, I'm thinking on the spot here, okay? Passive voice is a hard one for a lot of people because we write the way we talk. And when we're talking, we naturally use passive voice because humans by nature are over explainers. So we can't help ourselves. And so when we're writing, we write the way we would talk out loud, and that ends up putting a lot of passive voice in the moment. But passive voice is one of those things where once you can spot it, it'll stop happening altogether. I mean, not altogether, it'll still happen, but it'll happen a lot less, and your manuscript will thank you for it.
Yeah, I feel like I run into that when I write like third person omniscient.
It happens a lot in third
Yeah.
limited, a lot in third limited, a lot in third omniscient. It happens the least I find in first, but that's because we're naturally in that
Hmm.
character's mind. So we're not thinking of the actions specifically. If it does happen in first, it's because you're describing somebody else's actions and how they relate. But it's such a crutch in third. It's crazy, but it's because
It
you're
is.
trying to over explain things. And when we're talking about passive voice, stage direction kind of comes into this. And what I mean by stage direction, for anyone who hasn't heard the term, is stage direction is the way you would imagine actors on like an actual stage, everybody hitting their mark. So and so went from point A, and then they went to point B, and then they went to point C. And I think passive voice tends to fall in around all of those actions because we're like, so and so went here, and then they went here, and then they were here. And it's because we're trying to get everything on the page and we don't need to. It's trimming things down will naturally remove passive voice. It naturally removes stage direction. But I think we as writers, we can't help ourselves sometimes because if you do walk from one room to the next, you're walking from one room to the next. You're like, okay, I'll have my character walk from this room to the next room. But crazy idea, they could just be in the next room.
Thank you, Melissa, for giving us the hard truths because it's true. I'm always like, Michaela heard the door close. Well,
Oh,
just
that
say
is a
the,
passive voice thing
I
too.
know. It's like you could just say
I
the door
feel
closed.
I feel, I heard, I saw, I felt, I decided, I noticed, I looked. Passive voice also falls in with the past participle, so like ending in
Mm.
ed. So if they looked at something, they noticed something, they can see, I promise you, they can see in their own POV. You can just say, they closed the door. Or the example I always use is, I saw the bird sit on a fence. The bird just sat on the fence. A bird sat on a fence. You can do that, I promise, and it won't take anything away. I will say, once you start noticing those things, it's going to haunt you. You'll never not notice it now. It'll just kind of become natural to you. I have faith in you, first of all, Michaela. I
Thank
think
you.
you can do this. I think the
Thank
door
you.
can just shut, okay?
Thank you. I
You're
think I needed
welcome.
to hear this. I think this conversation needs to haunt me so I can stop doing it.
I'll
Because,
just slip into your
uh,
DMs, just
just
saying,
remind me.
shut the door. Just shut the door.
I'm gonna put that in a sticky note. The door can close. Just
The
shut it.
door can close.
A great writer's mantra.
No, I have one author who I've been working with, and stage direction and passive voice came up, and she told me the other day that now she can't unsee it when she's reading things. And
Hmm.
I think just once you have seen it a few times in your manuscript, it's you're gonna be able to spot it, and then when you write your next manuscript, you're gonna forget everything and have to go through the same thing all over again. But it's human nature for us to describe things that way because that's what we're seeing. Um, and we forget that these actions can just take place on their own. We don't need to push somebody to do that thing. She can just shut the door.
Thank you. Thank you. This is a great motivational pep talk for me.
I'm gonna put it on a mug or some of your merch or
Yes.
something.
Yes. Yes. Please sell that as merch. That's so good. I have a question from a viewer who added to my list of, hard things. And they
Okay,
asked
the hard hitters.
the hard hitters, when is the appropriate time to have a chapter break versus just ending the chapter?
That's a good question, first of all. I think there's a lot of misconception around the difference because there's a very significant difference between the two. If a chapter is breaking, a small amount of time has passed. The time has changed, the setting has changed, something significant has changed. It's what I call like a transportation moment. Like you're literally transporting somebody into the next moment without having to do all that stage direction in between. So if you want them to shut the door, you can just have them shut the door and then move on to the next scene. You can have a chapter break there. They don't need to shut the door and then walk down the hallway and then go down another hallway to get to where they need to be, or you don't need to describe them going to sleep to start the next morning. You can just use a chapter break and start the next morning. For chapter ends, these are much more significant. These are big pieces. Like you should be leaving someone on, like if your chapter is ending, you've left them on a cliffhanger, you've given your reader new information that they need to process. You're ultimately trying to achieve the just one more chapter.
Mm-hmm.
And to do this is kind of like a moment of tension, a moment of shock, or like I said, like a cliffhanger. But it's really just chapter breaks are smaller pieces of information in smaller moments of time. And the chapter ends are bigger moments of time or bigger pieces of information. Um, and they both play their role. It's definitely a fine balance. I'd say be careful of doing too many chapter breaks. This exists. There is too much. If you find yourself having to have too many chapter breaks, there's too much going on, and chances are you could probably combine a lot of that. For chapter ends, I feel like people naturally know where this ends. If you feel like a chapter end or a chapter beginning is lulling for any reason, I would look 3 paragraphs sooner at the end and 3 paragraphs later at the beginning, because chances are you have a natural place to end or start your chapter. You just started too soon or ended too late.
Yeah, that's really, really good advice. I like that. Along with that question, I had someone ask if you had like a list of common mistakes that authors could quickly revise in their draft, even before sending it to an editor. Just little things that you see happen.
2 things: filler words. Editors charge by the word.
Hmm.
So, filler words, just all right. So, of course, that all those extra words that aren't really needed, I would find a list of them because they exist. Um, or shameless plug, I have them listed on my threads. Go through and just revisit every instance of them. I have seen manuscripts that have the word just like 2,000 times. I am guilty of this because that's my crutch word, which is why I see it when it's happening. But there are so many other ones that people don't realize they're using a lot, or even phrases that they might use multiple times in the manuscript. But before you go to an editor, you can drastically reduce your word count. I highly recommend this for people pursuing traditional publishing as well, because it lowers your word counts for agents, which we're periodically moving toward lower word counts for manuscripts in general. That's something you can do. Another thing is, I think people struggle a lot with grounding their reader in time and place. This happens a lot at the beginning of chapters or the beginnings of a book in general. And if your reader doesn't have a good sense of where and when they are in the story, it's hard for them to orient themselves in your world, understand which character they're rooting for, and even just understand what time of day it is or night. For example, if you're looking at a haunted house, You're going to feel wildly different in the daytime than you do in the nighttime, which is why it's so significant that we make these clarifications. You don't have to say it was a random Tuesday at 5:07 p.m. You can just say the sun is about to set or something. Something. I'm sure you can think of something. We're all writers, but I think that is something that writers could really look at, because I know that we as editors are naturally looking for that, but people who are pursuing traditional publishing agents are also looking at.
Yeah, that's really good advice too. Now I'm going to go search my manuscript for filler words and be shocked, I'm sure, and the amount of times I use them.
Watch it be the word just. Or I
I know
want you to
you
go
said
to
that, and I
every
was like, hmm.
I want you to go to every instance of door and make sure the door is shut, okay?
Yeah, honestly, that's a good point. I should shut all of those doors. You also have services for the first chapter eval, which I think is great, and also probably a good service for someone who might want to be doing traditional publishing,
Mm-hmm.
because that's really great for that querying journey if someone asks for the first, 10 pages, like we know they love to do. So, do you have a philosophy on the first chapter? I feel like a lot of people have so many different opinions on the opening of a book.
That is why I do offer the first chapter, though. It's because I think it's so beneficial for people who are querying to be like, are my pages decent? But as for philosophy, I really think that I really want to say to focus on making sure that you've covered all of the W's. Like I know we're not in third grade, but we really need to know who we're rooting for. If you're starting with a prologue, this becomes really difficult for us to understand. I'm a big fan of the prologue, but you need to understand what's happening in the story, what the stakes are. Chances are, whether or not the stakes are relevant for now or later, the tension should already exist in your first chapter to set that up. The status quo for your character, no matter what it is, should have some sort of not wrongness to it, but a sense of not being right for them. There's clearly something that they want that they're unable to get, and we should get a sense of what that thing is within that first chapter. If this is a thriller, we should know what we're up against, whether it's hinted or foreshadowed. If this is a fantasy, try not to over explain the world in the first chapter. Let us get to know your characters instead. I think that's so much more important. We can world build for the rest of the book. That first chapter really is for connecting your reader, the character that they're going to be reading about for the next 100,000 words. For a romance, it comes back to character too. Like, who is this person? What are their flaws? Why aren't they getting what they want? If those things are on the page, you have a successful first chapter. Pending a million other things, obviously, but those should be there at the very, very least.
Yeah, no, that's good advice. And I like that, like going back to the W's, who, what, where, when, and
Who, what,
why,
where. Yeah, we need to know these things. We don't need to know it's a sunny day in California. Actually, I don't know. On a random Saturday. We just need to know Sarah is having, poor Sarah, I'm picking on her in these examples. Sarah is having a bad day for whatever reason, and we just need to know why.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Along with, you've talked about a couple different common mistakes that you see, but are there, I don't know, is there like a trend in, I guess I don't want to say like mistakes, but things that authors do that you get to go in and talk about, like almost on every single manuscript? Do you see that trend?
I feel like every manuscript is actually quite different. When I'm giving feedback on a manuscript, I find myself not ever really talking about the same things. If I am talking about something similar, chances are I'm talking about time and place, making sure you're grounding your readers, avoiding stage direction because it's just difficult to read and not engaging, and also pacing, just
Mm-hmm.
because if we're reading an action scene, we really want to feel, we want to feel that adrenaline rush of, oh my God, I might get a sword through me or something. Like, it's, those really are the things I think I comment on the most, is just making sure that we understand why we're there. We understand what's happening and the pace and the tension fit the scene.
Yeah. And I have one other question, my last question from a viewer who asked if it's common for editors to receive manuscripts where English is not the author's first language.
There's also editors who specialize in translated manuscripts like specifically. Those are the only manuscripts they will accept. There's also editors who speak different languages who work in both English and that language in order to offer editorial services, but it really depends on the editor. I do think someone who specializes in it would be far better than just any random editor because they understand it on a structural level, on a word level, which I think is so important. But this isn't at all uncommon. It's actually quite common.
I know we talked about obviously the amazing service of having an editor and how much of an investment it is, but how important of an investment it can be. But for anyone who might not be able to have that investment at this time or for this manuscript, do you have any parting advice for what someone can do to try and self-edit if they can't get an editor?
Yeah, I'd say first of all, there are editors who are willing to work with people who have different financial situations and might not be able to afford the cost all up front. I know I work with people for payment plans or we adjust different things. Like it really depends on the person and their situation. So first, if that's something you can do or something you're interested in, that's an option. A lot of people don't realize that that is an option. We're not expecting you to be able to pay this whole giant sum up front. It would be obnoxious. But for anyone where that still isn't feasible, for self-editing, there are a lot of self-guided editing resources out there. I know Jessica Brody has one. I don't know if it's free or paid. She does have one. She's the writer of Save the Cat for anyone who doesn't know. But there are resources that walk you through what you should be looking for a developmental edit, what you should be looking for a line edit, and then copy edit. But for those people, really build your alpha reader base, your beta reader base. Those are going to be so helpful as part of the process. I know a lot of authors who also use different programs to help them for like copy editing and stuff. ProWriterly Aid is one. I know there are some other ones lurking around there, but also most editors use the Chicago Manual of Style, and that's a resource you can access online as well, which can walk you through the different rules of grammar.
Yeah. So I know we've talked a lot about drinks and doors and editing. Where can our listeners find you if they want to learn more or partake in your services?
So I live mostly on Threads for whatever reason. That seems to be my platform. It's at Her Bookologist because I decided I wanted to be the book doctor a really long time ago, and that just I went with it. It's at Her Bookologist for Threads, Instagram, TikTok, or my website is melissaanndurston.com. I have everything linked on all of my socials, so it's really easy to find me. You can message me in any way that you want. If you want to have a conversation about writing, marketing, my services, or publishing in general, my DMs are open.
Great. And the very last thing before you go, and I put it in my email to you, and I read this in your bio. I have to know why you have 22 copies of The Great Gatsby.
This is so funny because I don't have 22 anymore. I haven't updated it in a while. It's 29 now.
Oh my gosh, it's so much more. Okay, I'm obsessed. What is the
Oh
obsession with The Great
my
Gatsby?
God. It's I don't even know why or when it started. It just my brightness just went really weird. And I had to read it in high school. A lot of people had to. And I don't think I fully understood the book back then.
Mhm.
So in adulthood, I was like, you know what? I'm going to read all the books I had to read in high school and see if they're worth their salt. And Frankenstein and Gatsby were the two that I was like, these are great. But for Gatsby, it was just I don't know. There's just something ethereally haunting about some of the imagery in that book. Like I think about the green light, which is a symbol in the book, and he's just like reaching out for it, but he can't quite touch it. And it has a lot to do with the American dream, but also unrequited love. And the damage of wealth and classism and all of these things. And I have no clue why it has stuck with me as much as it has, but it's my favorite classic book. Every time I visit a bookstore, I go to the section to see if there's a new one I can add to my collection. I have ones from the 50s. I have one that's like this big.
Oh, wow.
It's very small. I have special editions. I have graphic novel versions. I don't know. This book just hit me a different way, I guess. I don't think it's like the most beautifully written book. There are far better written novels out there, but there was just something about the lore behind the book on whether it was actually Scott who wrote it or Zelda who wrote it. I vote Zelda in case anyone's wondering, but I don't know. It stuck with me and I've been collecting it ever since. I don't have any plans to stop anytime soon. I would like to create a little shrine. You can actually see there's a scarf behind me here.
Yeah,
This was a Christmas gift and it has the book printed on it.
that's so cool. I
Yeah.
love it. I love when I feel like a lot of like writers and readers kind of cling to one book or one
There's
series and
something, yeah.
yeah, and they just like want to get every edition, everything, and
I
I
never
love
thought I'd be that person, let alone with such an old book. If you ask me my favorite book, it is not The Great Gatsby. I will say that. It's still Skyward until something else beats it. But it's my favorite classic and it's my favorite book to collect. And it's just, I don't know. Frankenstein is a close second on that
it.
front because that is also a good book. But I have to thank my great English teacher for that because she did a really great job teaching us about it. But yeah, Great Gatsby is half my personality, I guess.
I love it. Shout out to great high school English teachers.
Thank
Truly.
you, Mrs. Dunbar. I know you're not listening, but thank you.
And thank you, Mrs. Kupchak. I don't know if you'll be listening either, but you've shaped us all.
You shaped us all. We appreciate you so much.
Yes.
It was such a great time.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. This was lovely. I know
Mm.
we chatted for quite a bit, but
I know. You warned me though. You said we
I
might
did.
go over. Did I think we'd go this over? But we both like to chat, so it's been nice.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the podcast with Melissa Durston. I hope you guys got as much out of it as I did. I seriously now have so many sticky notes around my writing area that says things like, close the door and remember to ground the reader in time and place, and so many others. If you are new to Pen to Pod, please go ahead and listen to our backlist of interviews. I've interviewed some amazing authors this year, and there are more to come before the year is over. If you haven't already, be sure to follow the podcast if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That way you always get notified when a new episode drops. And what really, really helps us is if you are listening on those platforms of Apple, Spotify, drop a rating. That helps us tremendously. Drop a rating, let us know what you think. That will really help us reach more writers like you. Another quick and easy way is to just share an episode with another writing friend. If you are on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel at Mick Writes. And just thank you for all of the support that you guys have given this podcast. Okay, that's all from me because it's getting late and I have a word count goal to complete today. So if you're writing out there, just know I'm in the trenches with you. Happy writing!